Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. We have a very special guest today to join us for Perspectives on Philanthropy. As we search for context in our transforming world, what role does philanthropy play? Broadly understood to encompass the human voluntary spirit, philanthropy is responding in a variety of ways to the current global crisis. How is it doing, and what role will it have in the world that is emerging? We are truly fortunate today to have as our guest, Kari Niedfeldt-Thomas, Managing Director for Corporate Leadership with Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, also known as CECP. CECP is a CEO-led coalition that helps companies transform their social strategy. Kari is responsible for expanding and strengthening CECP's engagement with its coalition companies and partner organizations, and also for the organization's thought leadership, company advisory services, and growth strategies. The corporate leadership team creates value through strategic advisory and best practices across a range of environment, social, and governance issues, expertly curated knowledge, and convenings, including CECP's annual summit and bi-monthly roundtables. They also generate research and data insights to advance how companies measure, benchmark, and lead with their data and investments. And then there is CECP's Global Exchange, an international network uniting country-based, mission-driven corporate societal engagement organizations to advance the corporate sector as a force for good around the world. Prior to joining CECP, Kari led a consulting practice, which included working with Finnegan's and its affiliated entities. Finnegan's is the first beer company in the world to donate 100% of its profits to charity and is modeled after Newman's own social enterprise business, which played a role in the genesis of CECP itself, I understand. Kari also served as executive director of the Mosaic Company Foundation and directed the company's public affairs, global corporate responsibility, and agricultural sustainability strategies. During her tenure, Mosaic achieved ranking as one of the 100 best corporate citizens, according to Corporate Responsibility magazine, and did so for 6 consecutive years. It was also recognized with the CECP President's Excellent Award for the company's agricultural development partnerships in 3 countries. Kari holds a bachelor's degree in statistics and international studies from American University and a master's of business administration from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota, where she also serves as adjunct faculty. Kari has also served on several nonprofit and for-profit boards, including Impact Ventures Division and Grind Finals, the Business Advisory Group for the Office of Technology Commercialization at the Venture Center of University of Minnesota, and also with the Fraternal Insurance Company Degree of Honor Protective Association. In addition, her most recent distinction is that she is mayor of New Brighton, Minnesota, when she's not doing her day job, as she says. Kari, we're so pleased to have you, and welcome to Perspectives on Philanthropy.
Thank you so much for having me today.
We are keen to engage our audience and also to have our student kick off the audience questions as we go through our conversations. But to set the stage, I'd like us to start off with a few questions. So much has changed in the world since the pandemic and the calls for racial justice and equity. It seems that many corporations are leaning into this moment, and as their impact on environment, society, and governance becomes ever more salient. But before we dig into the roles of corporations in society and their contributions to social good, let's learn a little bit more about CECP. As I mentioned, there was some founding role that Paul Newman played with CECP, and the acronym stands for Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose. Kari, who is CECP?
So CECP was founded in 1999 by actor and philanthropist Paul Newman with other business leaders to create a better world through business. And CECP originally stood for Committee Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy. And then after many years, everyone just knew it as CECP, so we went by CECP. And then for our 20th anniversary a couple of years ago, we redefined the acronym and went from CECP to Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, but people generally call us still CECP. We're a CEO-led coalition, believe that a company's social strategy, how it engages with its stakeholders, which is employees, communities, investors, customers, determines that company's success. And we've grown to a movement, more than 200 of the world's largest companies. Those companies have committed $23 billion in total community investments. They have 14 million employees, 30 million in employee engagement hours, and we're a trusted advisor to corporate corporate CEOs and their corporate responsibility teams as they're leading on their corporate purpose strategies. And I'll say that it's called something different in every company. Some call it corporate responsibility, some have corporate foundations, some may call it corporate citizenship or sustainability. Whatever it is, those are the teams and their CEOs that we work with.
Terrific. And you generate a lot of important research and benchmarking, and your annual benchmarking report is called Giving in Numbers. And it is one of the leading insights into giving of corporate America. As you know, the CECP's data on corporate philanthropy is included in our research with Giving USA that measures giving in America every June. But this has been like any other year. What are some of the key impacts that you're seeing of the pandemic on the social roles of companies?
So the Giving in Numbers data from 2020 is still being completed. Companies are sending all of that final information to us today. So very soon we will have that report out this fall. But we do know from a series of pulse surveys that we've been doing throughout the year, we have moved to doing them weekly, that we have insights into how companies have responded. Plus we were holding a series of corporate peer discussions and a number of other ways to help companies connect to each other and make some changes. So we know from our last Giving in Numbers report that community investments increased by 7% from 2017 to 2019. And overall, we know that companies split their community investments around, the average is 48% are having it come from their corporate cash, 33% from their corporate foundations, and then there's 19% non-cash. That could be pro bono or in-kind support. And I will note that all of the reports that we talk about here are publicly available. CECP produces those for the field. So please go to our website, download whatever you might need for anyone watching. And Giving in Numbers has allowed us with the oldest historical data set to really be able to look at how the field has been evolving as the unrivaled leader on corporate social investments by companies. And we do that in partnership with them. And so I will say that we know from our pulse surveys from last year that starting in May, companies were identifying that their budgets were going to hold. About 64% said that we're going to be able to keep our budget depending on what's going on in the community. But we also know some of them, about 18%, noted it was going to increase for 2020. When they were projecting by the end of the year where they thought their budgets were going to be, what their forecast looked like, 32% said they would maintain their budgets and 43% predicted an increase. And all of that is because companies are looking at how they're going to respond to the calls for social justice, racial equity, pandemic response. And I will say that we do know from these series of pulse surveys that we were doing with companies along the way that companies said, we need to push back our bureaucracies. We need to lift up our communities. We need to just make this uncomplicated. Let all the rules fall away. So they were escalating payments to grantees, adjusting their policies for their community partnerships. They were making sure they were letting grantees redeploy their funds to general operating support and making sure that they were looking at how to take care of their employees with employee assistance funds. We never all thought we would, say the words virtual volunteering, but it's a thing now. And companies have also increased their matching gifts. They donated PPE that they had, and they just really trusted their community partners in a way that is encouraging. I said that this is the moment that they all trained for, and they stepped up to this marathon and made it happen. But companies also have had to pivot a bit. If they never funded a hospital or they never were funding hunger relief, they certainly made some decisions to do so. So we've really seen companies and their employees just look at this work in a new way.
Fascinating. And you mentioned, a couple of things I just want to pick up on. One is the kind of some company, it's the corporate purpose is called different things, and some companies use corporate cash and some use corporate foundations. Why is that? And are there any patterns or predictability in terms of what kind of companies use foundations? What kind of companies use corporate cash? Is there some method to the difference?
There's no method. I think it just depends on who has an idea and how they want to lead with it. For example, we track year over year on the number of foundations that the world's largest companies are reporting on. So companies in giving you numbers are 2 billion and larger in annual revenue. And we know that for every foundation that closes, there are more than that number that are reported on. So for example, companies may merge with another company. There may be 2 foundations. They have to roll one down, spend it down, and then they keep the other alive and are investing in it. I led a community of practice this last year on the future of corporate foundations and how companies are really innovating with their corporate foundations and looking at how to apply it in new ways. But I will say that, corporate contributions, just giving it straight from the company, has a bit more flexibility. There are a lot of rules with a foundation. So companies, I think, flex those in different ways. They like to consider all the tools that they could look at. But some companies have foundations, some don't. And so you will see some fluctuations probably based on industry also.
Oh, that's well. That's the other question I was going to ask you. You gave us a nice sense of the growing flexibility and openness and decrease in bureaucracy in the responses of the folks that you have surveyed. Is there any difference in terms of industry, kind of segments of industry, in terms of what you're seeing?
I would say that obviously this past year has been really hard for those who are in hospitality and the travel industry. Certainly those are not industries over this past year where we have seen that companies are looking at new opportunities. Those who have been in financial services have certainly, unlike what they were facing in 2008, those in financial services have been looking at how they can increase more broadly their community investment strategies and be able to work with their communities in new ways throughout this pandemic, being able to go local. If you think about what's been happening for all of the healthcare broadly, there have been some increases there. So medical device, biopharma, those industries are doing well, and there are a lot of investments going there. And at the same time, there's some innovation that's happening in their corporate responsibility teams.
Excellent. And I am seeing that some of you have already put in questions into the question and answer box. So as we're engaging with Kari, please put in your questions and we will get to them in due course. My next question is continuing on the pandemic and the fact that the pandemic has had a kind of very unequal impact on our society. And we are seeing businesses often being in the forefront and responding to some of these issues on racial justice and social equity. What are some of the most important trends that you have seen as you look at corporate efforts to create greater equity for Black Americans, other people of color, and women in society?
CECP has, for the last few years, been working with communities of practice, companies that are saying, can you help us sort out these issues? And we bring in experts and we talk through and look at what best practices are. So we held 2 years of community of practice on systemic investments in equity, talent, and tech. Out of that, we put out a paper and a video. We then also published in 2018 a report called Diversity and Inclusion in Corporate Social Engagement. And that publication has great insights. Again, encourage people to download it. And then out of that, we held a 2-year community of practice on diversity and inclusion. And we came away with the same learning from all of that, which is that when a company brings its core business needs in alignment with its social responsibility initiatives, that whether it could be grant making on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or it could be partnerships that they're developing, something magical happens. That companies really are able to take the concept of just diversity, equity, and inclusion and embed it into its business. It isn't just some add-on initiative, and that the community broadly benefits from that type of company engagement. So I'll give a couple of examples. If you think about grant making in K-12 STEM education, a lot of companies were saying, geez, we're making a lot of grants, but is this making a difference? But when they've partnered with their human resources department around really assessing how can they build their pipeline for recruitment and which institutions are they going to partner with? What are those skills that those individuals need? And how can they make sure that they're looking at potential internships and other kinds of mentorship? They're able to really holistically see this work anew. Same happened in this report. We note that some healthcare companies have talked about health equity as one of their priorities. And Cigna was an example where they focused on maternal health. And in doing so, it allowed them to bring some insights back to their business, be able to adapt service lines, and really tackle a pervasive business problem that they were facing. So we also see that corporate social responsibility and diversity and equity inclusion are being combined in some companies as one function, because they know that those individuals have a broad view of how they're engaging with society. It's not just in HR. They're really seeing it as building supplier diversity capacity. It could also mean that they're really looking at it from their board of directors, their senior leadership team, their staff development. How are they seeking representation on their board, in their senior leadership team, and being able to make sure that as a company that they're representative in the way that they want. Verizon's a great example about how they've been tracking a lot of those metrics. And next, we as an organization are really digging in on inclusion and equity. It is a hard area to measure. And if companies don't measure it and they don't report on it, they're not going to monitor it and they're not going to prioritize it. So we know that intentionality is critical, and we're going to be leading a new research publication on that.
Cool. Well, can you give us a sense of what are some of the things that you think are going to be measured that are going to be useful going forward? Can you give us any sneak peeks in terms of what you might be looking at?
So think about representation. Diversity is easy enough. You can check boxes to say, oh, this category is represented. This specific area, we have representation in our employees. We have representation with the nonprofits we're partnering with, what their boards, their participants, their staff members have. But how would you as a grant maker truly measure that you are creating inclusion in communities, that your partners are inclusive, that they are achieving equity? And there is one publication that I've been reading that I thought was fabulous, that really helped for me frame what I want to do with companies that we're working with, which is Chicago Beyond has put out a report called Why Am I Always Being Researched? And Liz Dozier is the CEO. She spoke at a recent equity event, a racial equity event that we held, and really some great insights for funders, researchers, and nonprofits about what it is that a nonprofit should ask for. And don't just let funders tell you what they want. Tell them what a true partnership looks like and how to really bring the community's voice forward in some of these decisions. So that's a quick glimpse into some of the conversations.
So Chicago Beyond,
yes,
is the one we should remember. Chicago Beyond and Why Am I Always Being Researched? So
yeah.
that sounds like a really interesting kind of community-focused approach to this, right? Well, great.
Yes.
Terrific. But, so we have seen change afoot even before the pandemic came. In 2019, the Business Roundtable issued a strong statement that the purpose of business was to benefit all of its stakeholders, not just shareholders, contradicting Milton Friedman's old saying that the business of business is business. And then BlackRock also decided that it would evaluate companies based on their environmental impact, not only on their financial metrics. We've already talked a little bit about kind of the growing attention to diversity, equity, inclusion after the killing of George Floyd. But there seems to be a broader and deeper transformation of this role of corporate purpose and the social role of corporations. What is going on here? And when you look at it very, from a broader perspective, are we going to expect businesses to solve our social problems now? What's going on?
Well, business has always played a role in supporting communities. It's provided jobs, pays taxes, individuals in those companies, their employees, they serve on boards, they volunteer, The company and those employees are contributing to causes, and companies broadly ensure that there are strong local economies providing stability and prosperity in various regions. Frankly, that's why Paul Newman started CECP. He was concerned that globalization was creating massive disinvestment of companies in their local communities, and he wanted to change that. But this past year, companies, like all of us, saw a need and stepped up. That's been a time of reflection. And if you think about what happened this past year for companies, it really brought their best forward in a way that they could help society in this time of need. Think about the innovation. Medtronic, for example, they open sourced ventilator code. These are lower end ventilators, and they encouraged others to use their intellectual property for free that they paid for to develop. Companies partnered with their competitors to create vaccines. Look at Sanofi and GSK, or there were companies that were manufacturing ventilators together, such as GM and Ventec Life Sciences. There were even lags in the supply chain, and some companies went to manufacturing 24/7. And an example would be Hanes manufacturing face masks, and then Apple donating them worldwide. So we've tracked year over year polling that CEOs have said that they know the most effective, bold move that they can make toward sustainable business leadership is to speak publicly in their own voice. So CEOs know that they play a role, and companies realize that they can't wait around for someone else to lead. They must be vocal, they must put their leadership in action, and that business isn't going to solve all social problems, but that they certainly should be a partner and use what they're good at. They're great at innovation, supply chains, financial vision, marketplaces, and all of that can drive results.
So are you seeing kind of CEOs becoming more, leaning more into their public roles as spokespersons about social issues?
Absolutely. We have seen that trend continually increase year over year. We've been monitoring polls that we hold at our closed door gathering for CEOs, where they're with their peers and they're asked in a number of different areas where they can lead, how they're leading, how they're looking at their corporate purpose initiatives. And CEOs have been saying regularly and increasingly that they know that they have a role to play, and they plan to have their company's purpose be front and center to be able to make a difference in society.
That's fascinating. In the New York Times today, there was the report of Ken Chenault and Ken Fraser speaking out against some of the voting laws that are coming in some states these days. So that's a very public engagement with a very public issue.
Yeah.
Let's speak a bit about these stakeholders that go beyond shareholders and how expectations are changing there. We know there are some demographic changes there. Last July, we had the pleasure of welcoming our alumnus, Derek Feldman. He had just released his book, The Corporate Social Mind, and he was looking at the changing attitudes of emerging generations and increasing different attitudes among both employees and consumers, who obviously pay maybe even closer attention to the social and public roles of corporations. What are you seeing in terms of your work, in terms of these two stakeholders and the demographic and attitudinal changes among employees and consumers? How are they fitting into the corporate purpose equation?
They are very critical stakeholders. Over the past several years, we've increasingly been seeing the trend and talking about how employee power has increased from social media access. If companies aren't happy with your company, they'll go to social media. There's also internal advocacy, employees coming forward and expressing what they want for their company, directly emailing the CEO at times. Employees are using their voices to tell their employers what they want. And additionally, we know from employee volunteerism, as an example, and matching gift programs, that employees want choice. They want these to be seen almost as part of their benefits. And some companies actually are talking about it that way in their recruiting, putting it in their materials. And that is why you've also seen a drop in just generic workplace giving programs that are more prescriptive. Employees are like, we don't want you as an employer to tell me where to put my money. I want to tell you where I want to put my money, and I want to tell you even where we think you should put your money. So it's an interesting shift for employers to have their employees engaged in that way. I would also say younger generations have growing influence on what their expectations of their employers and consumer brands are. They want businesses to be responsible, transparent, contribute positively to the environment and society, and they want principles as a part of the financials. And so we had recently a group, the Millennial and Gen Z community, share with companies how they would know, for example, if companies are doing what they said they were going to do on some of their racial equity statements that they made. And those young leaders said, oh, we'll find out. We know how to research. We aren't just going to read your reports. We're going to go to the web. We're going to figure things out in chat rooms. We're going to talk to our peers. And so we know that employees and customers, they're just looking for companies to be a part of these solutions. We regularly are tracking some of the research of the Edelman Trust Barometer, which recently released that business is the most trusted institution between the 4 areas of government, media, nonprofits, and business. And this is in the US and globally. And business is, through their research, seen as the only institution that is both ethical and competent. And so when we know when business and nonprofits partner together, trust increases for both of them. And employees also, through that research, have said that their specific employer is more trusted to them than nonprofits, business, government, and media. So that means that employees are saying, you as my employer are my source of information. I trust you. And so it's no wonder in 2020 that companies really stepped up, that they looked internally how to take care of their closest stakeholder, their employees. But then they also were saying, okay, we're not going to lay off, or we're going to allow you to work from home, or here's some PPP. But also, excuse me, PPE, not PPP. But then companies are also just saying, you know, with their customers, how do you connect? How do you have them feel like they're a part of your company? And that intersection there that we're talking about, this trust in companies, is really critical, and CEOs and companies are paying attention.
Well, that's certainly fascinating. So if I email a CEO, what do they have a staff to actually respond to those kind of direct emails? I mean, how do CEOs of very large companies make themselves be accessible, or at least seem accessible?
Well, we could tell you there are a number of CEOs who have talked to each other about the fact that they respond directly to their employees' emails. And, you know, I think it depends on what the email is about, of course. But if it's in a way where an employee is politely asking for your company to be a leader, think about all the companies that are coming out right now with statements around stopping Asian American Pacific Islander hate. That hashtag and companies' commitments, financial commitments also, are not just internally, but it's out in the community. They're wanting to use their voice to send a message that we're here for you. We are a partner and we want to do good. And that kind of conversation is different. It is not the way that business used to be. I know years ago, if anybody had said a frontline employee emailed the CEO, people would be shocked about it. But it is common now, and CEOs are embracing that and knowing that this is their role, and their employees are looking to them for that.
That's fascinating. So that's amazing, you know, in terms of the buy-in from employees and consumers that you're talking about. And all Americans at some point are employees and consumers. Not as many Americans are investors, which have typically been the shareholders that, you know, the Milton Friedman model had us believe is where the power is. But, you know, investors still, you know, provide the money that is the investment fuel. How is the relationship with investors and corporations changing? We hear so much about ESG, environment, society, and governance. Even the SEC seems to be, you know, thinking about including that in regulatory in kind of regulatory regimes as well. What are we to make of these changes? Is this marketing? Is this real? What's going on?
It's real. And I will note that I am more of a Professor Edward Freeman fan than I was a Milton Friedman fan, but that's, you know, Freeman is known for stakeholder theory. And I would say that that's how the majority of companies that we're working with are thinking about their work, and ESG fits into that lens. ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is both the programs and management of companies. And it's also how investors are prioritizing looking for companies who are making those commitments and leading in that way. ESG index funds generally have outperformed basic index funds. More ESG investment products are being created. ESG factors are increasingly being reported by companies. And they're expanding this work because they're measuring it through scorecards, they're assessing their progress, they're charting their path forward. And that collaboration, looking at various frameworks and standards and listening to stakeholders is important. So one example would be the World Economic Forum just recently released a report on universal and expanded metrics, and they included CECP's total social investment metric, or TSI, and that we put out 2 publications on the S and ESG several years ago, looking at a number of ways that companies are investing in society beyond grant making and their community investments. And so several years ago, CECP developed our CEO Investor Forum, which is now a network of companies committed to ESG and long-termism. Think about it as there are the quarterly traders who are just looking for how a company's earnings are going to go up. But then there are those who are making commitments long-term. They want to see that your company is making investments and planning for that. And we've had over 30 CEOs deliver their long-term plans to institutional investors through our CEO Investor Forum. We've put out research that shows that companies associated with higher purpose are outperforming on common measures related to financial performance, valuation, value creation. And we have a number of partnerships related to this, but ultimately, when you look at all of the Bloomberg database measures on the E, S, and the G, you can see that while the environment may have some investments that companies are making related to regulatory issues or cost savings on, making some decisions and how they're going to run their business. Ultimately, we also know through a factor analysis that we've done on a report that's coming out next week, Investing in Society, that companies, when they're looking holistically at their ES and G, they're able to see some greater returns. They're interconnected.
That's fascinating. Doing good by doing well by doing good. I think that's
Exactly.
the positive idea from the investor class as well. But let's consider maybe some of the limitations, or how we should think about where the social purposes of corporations butt up against other public institutions like government, which we actually vote for in terms of, we're equal in front of the government. How are we to think, Milton Friedman's dictum is often seen as being kind of hard-nosed about profit and being stingy. But the other side of his dictum is that, there is a role for business in society, and there's a role for public institutions, the governments, and you have just become a mayor, so maybe you can speak from a personal perspective as well. As companies, we expect companies to be more socially conscious. What does that do to the public institutions that in front of which we're not judged by how much we buy or whether we work for a company or whether we invest in it, but simply by being citizens? How are we thinking about that connection or that delimitation between public institutions and corporations, and who's responsible for making sure that the social outcomes are representative of society as a whole?
I think that companies are partnering cross-sector in really unique and innovative ways. I can think of a number of companies that have taken on a more collective impact view, and they're building partnerships that are cross-sector. They're working with nonprofits, they're working with government, and they're all coming together to tackle, I will call it, ecosystem change topics. Those are inspiring stories when companies are realizing that they don't have to solve it on their own, when nonprofits who are looking for funding to support their work find partners, and they can bring in a full lens and a commitment to solving these issues. We worked with companies a few years ago, helping them to look at the opioid crisis as an example. That is an ecosystem topic that is both around how companies are supporting their employees and their employees' families through insurance plans, and how they're providing access to other resources and information, but it's also around using your voice as a champion in society. The underpinning to corporate social responsibility is actually business ethics. That's the precursor academically. And if you trace it back and look at how companies are looking at everyone in society as value, and that companies are recognizing that there's a way, yes, there are all these rankings and ratings and frameworks and standards and tracking through Global Reporting Initiative and Carbon Disclosure Project, but when companies can really say, we can make a difference, we can make catalytic investments with our community, with government, with academic institutions, with nonprofit organizations, and we can together build that trust, build results, you'll find that you'll get better outcomes. I will also add one other note, which is that, right now, we know that we did some tracking through our Pulse survey back in January that a number of companies stood up on the attack on the Capitol. And 2/3 of the companies that have a PAC reported to us that right after that, they suspended their contributions to send a message about the kind of government stability they wanted. And that's powerful. Money speaks, as we know.
That's fascinating. We mentioned the New York Times story today about the voting laws, and we're seeing different responses. For example, in the regulatory space, some tech companies are running away from regulation. Facebook seems to be saying that maybe some new regulation is needed in there. How does your organization approach things that are quote unquote political in terms of kind of labor unions, minimum wages, and lobbying that corporations do? Do you have any views on that, or is that kind of left to each corporation?
CECP, we operate in many ways like an association, but we're not an association in that we do not have government advocacy that we do. But we certainly are bringing topics forward to CEOs and to the corporate responsibility teams to have them think about their role in society in new ways. So absolutely, we brought a speaker in to one of our board events a few years ago to talk about living wage and help CEOs think about it. We know for a fact that a few CEOs went back to their offices and said, I want to see our salary data. I want to know, are we paying our employees a living wage? And so those kinds of conversations, doing it in a way where you're not shaming people, you're not calling them out publicly, but you're giving them the information and the resources and the access to be able to make decisions. It may be obvious to some people, but if you're in a day-to-day business and you're doing mergers and acquisitions, you're having various operational decisions that you have to make, sometimes you can just not be immersed in it if your team doesn't bring those topics forward. So we're helping by bringing them forward, helping companies to think more holistically about their role.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you one more question that's less, that's kind of more standard before we open up the questions by asking Jumana Harris to begin our question and answer period. And this is a question for, there's quite a few fundraisers and philanthropically minded professionals in the audience. And there was also a question that was on this topic that was pre-submitted by one of our audience members. And that has to do with the standard corporate donations have been at about 5% of total American giving for not forever, but for almost as long as we've been measuring. And around that number, there's been a lot of innovations, and you've spoken to those partnerships and community investment and the explosion of ESG and purpose more broadly. But that donation number, it's you can either see it as a ceiling or a plateau, but it's been pretty persistent. How do you interpret that 5% of corporate donations as being just so persistent? It's either a good story in terms of it's been hanging in there, or my goodness, it's not gone up even as we have generated all this wealth.
There are a lot of ways to look at that data. So CECP puts out evaluation guidance to be able to help companies benchmark their total giving. And we help them track it in a few ways as a percentage of pre-tax profit. and as a percentage of total revenue. So when you're saying stock market going up and down, there are a lot of ways to approach this topic. I will also say that the number of publicly traded companies has gone down over the years. People may not realize that. So there are lots of impacts about why things are like they are. I think that typically you would see less growth from one year to the next, which is why we in our Giving in Numbers report look at it from a 3-year match set. Our numbers are continually increasing year over year. Last recorded Giving in Numbers tracked 24.8 billion in corporate community investments. That was in 2019. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that while we talk a lot about the 1% of pre-tax profit, I would say that that's the gold standard that a lot of companies work to get toward. We also share where top quartile companies are, really those who are knocking it out of the park, as they would say. And but tracking those 990s alone isn't going to help anyone really understand where companies are making their investments, because they're doing it in more ways. We just talked about living wages. We talked about development pathways for people of color in companies. Think about social impact internships, investing in ecosystems. There are lots of different models for how companies are investing in their communities through that total social investment metric. It's not just grants. And I think if we all step back, and we're hoping to be able to help companies continually increase the many ways that they're tracking and measuring their work, we know that if you step back, you would actually see that it's more. But if you're only going to look at grant making through corporate foundations, for example, it may not look like there's a big growth.
Great. Thank you, Kari. That's excellent context in terms of understanding why the 990s alone, which is the core of the measure, is missing a good bit of what's going on. Well, let's turn to a new tradition that we have in terms of making sure that we include our students in these events. I'm pleased to introduce Jumana Harris, who is finishing her first year in the master's program, and I'm happy to say that next academic year she will be serving as a graduate assistant and working with CECP to dig into some of these issues. So, Jumana, the floor is yours. Make sure to unmute.
Sorry about that. As much as I use Zoom, you'd think I'd figure that out by now. But so happy to be here with you all. I just asked if you could share a bit about the impact of purpose on the performance of corporations, whether that be financial or in some other way, and share some of the benefits or the value that corporate purpose can provide for both the corporation as well as stakeholders.
Absolutely. So I think we mentioned before about our upcoming Investing in Society publication that's coming out. And if you think about that, report is designed to track the state of corporate purpose across a range of environmental, social, and governance metrics. And there are countless ways inside of that publication that you will see that companies are looking at. How do you define purpose? What does it mean? So yes, philanthropy is one piece to it. And I would say generally companies don't talk about philanthropy as much. They talk more around community investments. They look at these as partnerships that they're developing. But also we can say that through our recently released value volunteering report, we have tracked how companies are best partnering with their communities, with nonprofit organizations, and that there are built-in results to some types of volunteering, and then there are built-for results, like intentionality that companies and their community partners are putting into volunteer projects. Those are purpose-driven ways to engage employees, and I would say that companies that are leading with purpose are embedding that those values in all that they're doing. And so I would say that from a range of stakeholder views, whether it's looking at your supply chain to looking at ways that you're partnering in your very local communities, companies are considering the whole range of options to lead with purpose.
Terrific. Let me, go to one of the questions from the audience. Judy Hartling says, do you see corporations donating corporate funds so they can quote unquote leverage nonprofit relationships for marketing or other benefits? How do you feel about this practice? So we've all heard critical views of greenwashing, but perhaps you can tell us kind of illustrate when these kind of partnerships can happen with integrity and with good outcomes.
I think the important part is that everybody speaks up for what they're looking for in a partnership. And the report I mentioned earlier is a great example of often nonprofits over the years felt like any funder asking them to do something that they had to say yes. And nonprofits should speak up for what they're looking for and should make sure that the community is centered at the middle of it. There are many nonprofits who could say, I received a call and said, I want to bring 20 people to your office today to volunteer. What do you have for us to do? That's not a great partnership. You should be in ongoing conversations around what each other is looking for. I would say that there are expectations by companies. The larger the grant, the deeper a partnership, that there is a way to talk about it. I think that companies recognize that their employees aren't going to know that they're doing it. And the community, their customers, we've talked about these broader stakeholder lenses. No one's going to know that they're doing it if they don't talk about it. And often years ago, we call that the confetti approach, that companies were making grants to lots of nonprofits. And it was, you asked for a grant, it was small, they'd give out lots of them. Companies are moving to more concentrated approaches. They're wanting to have it align with specific priority areas that they've identified that often are aligned with what their mission is. It could be what they're doing in the world. And they want to be able to tell that story. And part of that is it's important for them to be able to reach their internal stakeholders. And then there are some external stakeholders. So I'd say nonprofits have to decide what you're comfortable with. What do you feel is a fair partnership? And my encouragement is whatever anybody's looking for needs to go in a grant agreement. Make sure it's clarified, that everybody's clear, how many tweets someone's going to get. Is there a sign for a capital project? Whatever it is, just make sure it's spelled out. That protects donor intent, and it also makes sure that the nonprofit gets what they're expecting and that they're also, they're fairly represented in what they want. But nonprofits have a voice and they should speak up for what they need.
That's a very good guidance. I see that Jumana has another really important question. Jumana, would you like to ask your questions live?
Sure, it was pretty long, so I just put it in there. But I have recently been doing more research on the needs of Indigenous communities in our country. And historically, they have been drastically underfunded by the federal government as well as philanthropy. And I just wonder if you can speak at all to specific efforts made by corporations to support and invest in these communities. And then furthermore, if you could speak at all to what, if CECP has a perspective on what it looks like and what it means to shift power to traditionally marginalized communities in an effort to ensure a more just and equitable society. So that's a whole lot, but.
Right, thank you. I will note that there are some amazing organizations that are focused on they're philanthropy serving organizations. They are intended to help other grant makers, could be individuals, it could be companies, with their grant making philosophy, how they're approaching those relationships. And your note around that there has been a disinvestment at times. It depends on where the community is. Let's say the Native American Indigenous community is. If it's in rural communities, oftentimes companies, if their headquarters or their locations are in urban centers, that's not one of their geographies that they're funding. That can cause to some disinvestment. Also, it can be if they're proposing something that is not in one of their pillars, their specific strategic priority areas, there can be disinvestment there. And so my encouragement is that both companies and Indigenous communities should have conversations around what their interests are. For example, when I was at the Mosaic Company, there were conversations with First Nation communities in Saskatchewan around how to be able to build a skilled trades pipeline. And then that would allow for those individuals to work with Mosaic. So Mosaic made some investments in some of the schools in Saskatchewan to be able to support the building of that skilled work. So I think there's some unique ways that companies can partner, but there have to be honest conversations. And there have to actually be conversations. It can't just be companies are disinvesting. Tell a company they've been disinvested. Help them understand where there's a need. Because I'll tell you right now, companies are looking for opportunities where they can be authentic. They don't want to come in and say, we have all the answers. So approach them, let them know what the needs are. And I guarantee they'll listen. And if they don't, call me, I'll let you know. I'll get through to them.
Great. Well, thank you for offering that, Kari. And let's say you mentioned the Edelman Trust Barometer ranking business not high in terms of trust, not only domestically, but internationally. And we mentioned at the outset that CCP's mission is not simply domestic, but international as well. Can you give us a sense of what you do internationally and what you're seeing kind of internationally in terms of long-term trends and also responses to the pandemic? Because certainly the responses to the pandemic have been very different across different countries.
Absolutely. And the calls for racial equity look different in every country around the world also. How we define it in the United States looks very different than every other country. You noted earlier that CECP had started our global exchange. We knew that we were not going to set up a CECP in every country around the world, but we did want to have a group of partners, country partners that are representing, and they partnered together. They just put out an inaugural report called Global Impact at Scale. Global Impact at Scale. And the paper is a one-of-a-kind research study that is looking how global company actions related to their ESG. Of note, I will say that 81% of the companies that were surveyed for this report have stated that they've acted on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and that they're using them as a framework for their reporting. And that is a really great way, I would say, for nonprofits to be able to frame their work that they're doing around the SDGs when they're looking to partner with companies. And then I will just say that that is an increase of 20% from last year. So we know that that's increasing. We also know that through some of our matched set research from Giving in Numbers, that international community investments have been growing significantly. So it was 49% over just the last 3 years. And then it was for a 5-year match set, 29%, and then going back 10 years, 22%. So you can see that that has escalated over time. Companies are looking at how they can make a difference everywhere that they have operations.
That's fascinating. And so can you give us some examples? I know in some countries they have kind of, and maybe even in some states, some requirements for board representation on different boards, and kind of different regulatory schemes. How was the different regulatory environment in different countries affecting the way your members and your contacts internationally are thinking about how to lean into questions of equity?
Oh, certainly it varies in every country. Some countries have reporting requirements, like India. I know that through some of my experience, China has very specific requirements for companies that have an operation there and how they're going to engage and which types of entities they can engage with. I think when you're talking about it as from an equity lens, generally, everyone is comfortable, typically in all the countries, talking about serving those who are vulnerable, communities that have needs that are not being covered potentially by a government social service system or through the NGO community. I will say that there are some countries that don't want to talk about certain ethnic groups that might that are through reports that we all have not being treated as international standards would expect. And there are sensitivities there. And so I would say that how we are working with country partners is to, let's say, not hone in on specific ethnic groups or specific racial identities, and instead referring to it as those who are marginalized or disadvantaged. And those kinds of terms are best for companies when they're looking to work cross-border.
Great. Well, we have quite a few students online, and you have had a splendid career where you have managed to combine business with social impact. And as you say, there's a variety of ways that different corporations call these roles. What advice would you have for some of our students who would be interested in doing something similar to you, being able to combine kind of business savvy with social impact? What career advice would you be able to share?
I would say first, you need to volunteer a lot. Volunteer with nonprofits, volunteer on boards, volunteer for social enterprises, helping those startups. Those are a microcosm of a large corporation, and looking at how you also can apply your consumer dollars to supporting companies that are wanting to do good. By working with these organizations as either an investor or a coach or a leader, you see how capitalism can be accessible, how social structures, to whether it's through wages that people are paying or how you're leading with purpose and building partnerships. There are many segments to my career, and all of them led with me being curious, me looking at, okay, I've not worked in that sector before. I think I need to. I need to understand how to be able to influence and make a difference in new ways. So I have experience in how a food shelf works on the ground and how youth programs work and how environmental issues can be played out in communities and through advocacy. But I also understand how to be able to frame those same issues in the C-suite. And I will say that I think it can feel like, well, I want to work in corporate responsibility, but I don't want to work for a company. You have to know how to work in a company or with a company for a company to want to hire you. So a company's not going to hire someone because they have a lot of great social ideas. There are plenty of those. You have to understand the business and how to be able to apply that in a way and take the business purpose and putting it forward in a way that can maximize both growth for the company and at the same time maximize societal impact. It can't just be societal impact and no financial growth. So you have to keep that in mind. You have to be comfortable with that environment to be able to work in corporate responsibility.
That's great. You have to exercise different muscles. That's really good advice. Yeah. A slightly more technical question having to do with taxes from one of our, Dr. Mahmoud Hai asks, will the planned increase in corporate taxes decrease donations? Maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of what your perspective is on the relationship between the tax regime and corporate purpose, especially corporate donations.
So as noted earlier, we always encourage companies to track it based on revenue or on pre-tax profit. And that is because whatever the tax structure is will change, and having a stable way to be able to look at your community investment strategy is important. One of the ways that we've advised companies is to look at a 3-year rolling average backward. So if you were to look at your pre-tax profit, but having it be post-tax is not a way that we're encouraging companies, and we haven't for years. I would say that, as you know, where companies may put their headquarters and what kind of tax incentives different regions may provide them to relocate their headquarters all have lots of implications. And I will be honest, the conversations we're having with companies around tax changes have not at all been anyone being concerned about their community investment budgets. They're feeling firm that they are charting the path that they have, and their boards have approved a collective community investment strategy of both foundation and corporate money, and they're executing in that way.
Great. Terrific. So you deal with, CCP deals with large corporations, but you have a variety of experiences, and some of our students and some of us deal with smaller corporations. Do the same principles that you've outlined hold for smaller companies, or does the situation change when the resources are smaller and the scale is smaller?
It certainly looks different in smaller companies than it does for larger companies. Often larger companies will have teams that are dedicated to focus on these issues. Those team members are working cross-functionally. They're working with human resources. They're partnering with their investor relations teams. They're looking at opportunities to pull insights cross business and be able to have those programs roll out across their business. For smaller companies, I would say the big challenge is just resources to do it. Often you'll find that volunteerism programs could be managed by the human resources specialist that is in one particular plant in a particular state. And it's kind of a more diffused strategy, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. It certainly is, and those team members do what feels right and relevant to their employees and to their business. But it's harder if you are a nonprofit looking to access those smaller companies, because you're not quite sure what your entry point is. You have to ask questions and find out who's leading your community partnership strategies. But I will say that because those smaller companies don't necessarily have bigger teams, means that they are also really hungry for great partners. They're looking for people who can bring to them solutions to be able to engage their employees, make a difference, show what their company's purpose is about. And so it's complicated in that the nonprofit probably has to do a bit more, but the nonprofit can also has a really big opportunity to be able to go deep with that company, have people serve on your board, be able to do skills-based volunteering projects. There are a lot of really amazing examples I can think of where smaller companies and nonprofits have just built these relationships that feel true to their values, both of them.
Interesting. That's terrific. That's terrific. So as one of our attendees also asks about if the Pulse surveys are available. I'm assuming all the resources you spoke about are free and available on your website, right?
So we do have some of our Pulse surveys available on our website. Absolutely. They are through our website. We have a whole series of thought leadership and resources. So if you go into our website, you can look at them, and we regularly are putting out in our blogs and other information the Pulse surveys that we're doing.
So where do you turn to get context on the word at large? Not only corporate purpose, obviously CCP has a lot of great resources, but who do you follow? Who do you listen to? What do you read to keep abreast of not only corporate purpose, but the context to help make sense of it?
I read a lot of LinkedIn posts, a lot of tweets, and I would say that I, committed to following our CECP affiliated companies so I can stay up to date on what they're working on. We are regularly in conversations every week with companies. They send us requests. Can we have some information on this? And then our team pulls together some information and sends it back out. So we have a good sense of what companies are looking for, what their issues are. All of it depends on, what industry they're in, or it could be there's a new CEO that has some new ideas, and then the team is kind of like, all right, we're redoing our strategy, it looks like. And so we're continually working to be able to assess that. I always work to take a look at cross-sector reports, because I do believe that there are learnings in the way that let's say family philanthropy, which has some parallels at times to corporate philanthropy, that there are other research studies being put out by institutes that helps me to gain a sense of what's happening in economics, both for vulnerable communities and the pressures that there will be on the nonprofits, while at the same time helping our companies to understand some of the landscape issues in different communities that they're working in. I would say our pulse surveys are like my regular digesting of information. We're analyzing our research, and then we're always working on new research publications. We have 2 annual publications, but all of the other ones that I've mentioned are ongoing new ways that we're pushing boundaries. And so that gives me plenty of opportunity. We're going to be kicking off one on the future of work coming up and how companies are looking at that. I mentioned our work that we're going to be leading on inclusion and equity. And then I would say there's some new report that we're going to be working on related to corporate foundations and innovations that we've been seeing. So some of what I'm reading is how companies are leading, and they share with us their information. They trust us. We aren't, again, we're not designing what we're working on to shame them. We're working to elevate what we see as the best practices. And so I will say those keep me busy. Plenty of reading.
That's great. Yeah, well, I'm very curious to learn about the future of work, because everybody wants to know, are we going back to campus or not? So hopefully you can help us answer that question. But I agree with Sarah Jelly, who had wrote in the question and answer that this has been fabulous and that Kari is a great resource. And she says, thank you. And before I say thank you, let me ask you a little bit, something related to the way we are now living at work and what you do and what you learn from maybe your members, because they're all dealing with this. What are some resources, what are some therapies that you have in place to manage this situation where we're all kind of not working at home, but really living at work?
So yeah, it's been a year. Everyone's tired for a lot of reasons, right? You were mentioning like virtual learning, both for those who are attempting to be in college, and then also for all the parents who are working at home and have the privilege of also sitting next to their kids with their iPads. But it's a wild time in society. And I think that what we've seen, everyone wants to get back to networking. They want to see each other. But when we set up opportunities for networking, people are tired. But what people do appreciate are just small, condensed ways to understand information. Just give me 3 bullets that I can pay attention to right now. And so we've started these weekly CEO emails that have changed up our format on how we were communicating. Same for some of our corporate leaders that we're working with, just simpler ways to think about it. Smaller communities to talk through issues. I will say for my team, I started a weekly Friday gratitudes. We call them fratitudes, just a way for everybody to stay connected to each other, because it's hard. It's a hard environment to feel like you're continuing to build your relationships. And so I think if everyone stays grounded in that, that's important. That's part of why I ran for mayor. At a time of need in society, I felt like I had gifts that I could give and I could contribute. And so I ran a campaign in a pandemic and went door to door with a mask on and ran social media campaign. And, if you had asked me a year ago if I was planning this, I would have said no. But this has given me an opportunity to stay grounded and connected to residents and businesses, and to be able to help through a time in society where I feel that people need it.
That's terrific. Well, Mayor Kari, what is your top platform in terms of your new administration? What are we looking forward from you? What's going to happen?
Our city is going to be starting our inclusive commission this fall. We had 3 years ago had an inclusive task force that made a series of recommendations, and I was clear in my campaigning that we need to make sure that we have a welcoming community, and everything's gone well, but I live in the Twin Cities, and we're mindful that there's more that we can do. There's more that we can do to have everyone feel welcome. And so that will be happening. We're also looking at how to be able to take our comprehensive plan, which is a really large document that's shared with our Metropolitan Council, but we need to make sure that we build out what the years forward are going to look like. So some of my expertise around scorecards and measurement and dashboards, we're going to be putting all of that together. We developed a COVID dashboard, so a few things we've been working on.
Terrific. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's fascinating, and we wish you well in your journey of inclusiveness and the wonderful work I'm sure you will do as mayor, and your continued success at CCP. Thank you for your generosity in sharing so much of your knowledge with us, and we look forward to having Jumana join you as a graduate assistant and continuing to work and learn together with you in the world of philanthropy. Jumana, do you have any last question that has come to mind, or shall we just thank Kari for her time? And
no, thank you so much, and I'm very excited to work with you in the future.
Great. Well, thank you, Kari. This has been wonderfully stimulating and enlightening. For those of you who know of your colleagues who weren't able to attend, we will be sharing the recording. Thank you all of you for participating and asking your good questions. Our next Perspectives on Philanthropy will be on April 21, when our guest will be Stacy Palmer, the editor of the Chronicle of Philanthropy. I wish you all a safe day, and thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Kari. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye.